everybody, and welcome to Office Hours as we allow folks into the Zoom webinar and go live on Facebook. We're glad that you're with us this chilly Atlanta morning. If you're in Atlanta, maybe chilly or other places that make me feel like a wuss, but we are glad it's warm here and we have warm company as always. This is week 2 in our thematic study of Mary in the New Testament and beyond. And here we really this week get into the and beyond portion. My name is Chris Holmes. I'm the scholar in resident at First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta. I'm joined by Dr. Brennan, Old Testament professor at Columbia Theological Seminary. And our distinguished guest this week is Dr. Brittany Wilson, who is a professor of New Testament at Duke Divinity School. Also was one of my TAs at seminary, at Princeton Theological Seminary. So we're keeping this sort of Princeton Theological Seminary, Emory graduate school connection deep in this office hours sequence. So we're glad, Brittany, we're so glad that you're with us this morning. And we're glad that folks are joining us from across the country. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to see both of you.
It's so great to be with you. So Brittany, as you know, we generally, we start with a question about the reading and interpretation of sacred scripture, because that's where it was birthed as a Bible study. And so we always ask our guests to think about and share with us a little bit of their sort of theological or cultural assumptions that they bring with them to the reading and interpretation of scripture. And we would love for you to take a few minutes to share some of your own as you read scripture and maybe as you teach students to be good readers of scripture.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Chris. So I teach in a divinity school. So I think because of that, I really am interested in these larger theological questions. Whenever I read scripture, I'm always interested in the kind of so what, right? What does this matter for the church? What does this matter for us as we read these sacred texts? And I would say also that in terms of my own approach to reading scripture, I tend to exemplify what I like to call a kind of narrative theological approach. So that's not to say I'm not interested in questions of history. I very much am. But for me, as I read these texts, I'm always interested in the narrative world of the texts and the literary aspects of the text. I really like narrative. Perhaps that's why I focus primarily on the Gospels and my own research and studies. But that tends to be my own hermeneutical, if you will, my own interpretive approach towards reading scripture.
I love that. Yeah, and so much that we could say about the intersection of narrative theory, but again, the ways that these texts draw us into themselves is so powerful. So we're going to talk about some of your earlier work later in our conversation this morning, but we always like to ask our guest hosts sort of what are they working on. If you have any books or research projects that are exciting you or that you'd like to share with us and our viewers, we love to hear what people are working on.
Yeah, thanks. So I have a book that's coming out in April. I'm ready for it to be done with it and to have it come out. And that book is on divine embodiment in the New Testament. And I got interested in this topic because I feel like today, many Jews and Christians sort of think of God as being this kind of invisible, disembodied being. But a lot of Old Testament and Hebrew Bible scholars have really been pushing back against these modern sort of assumptions that many of us bring when it comes to our understandings of God. And a lot of these Old Testament and Hebrew Bible scholars are looking at, Jewish scriptures, are looking at the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, and saying, hey, wait a minute, we've got God wrestling with Jacob. We have all these visions of God. We have this, in prophetic text in the Psalms, this sort of longing to see God, right? So perhaps God isn't as invisible and disembodied as many of us assume today. And in this book, I am really kind of taking up a lot of that work that's being done from these scholars and applying it to the New Testament. And I'm arguing that oh, hey, actually, this sort of tendency of depicting God in more visible and tangible ways, that actually appears in the New Testament as well. And I think it has really important implications for Christology, or how we understand the New Testament's portrayal of Jesus, especially with respect to its portrayal of Jesus vis-a-vis God. Right? How do we understand Jesus in relationship with God? So that's what I've been working on for the past few years now, and that's what my book's going to be about.
That is super important. That's so just super cool stuff. And I mean, in Old Testament studies, Benjamin Summer has got that great book, The Bodies of God, and then Mark Smith at Princeton has a new book about God as embodiment. And so this is a super hot topic. Yeah, where the gods are. Yeah, great book. And the Benjamin Summer book is an excellent one too, an award winner. But it's there you go, Bodies of God in the Ancient World. Yeah, and those are fantastic, really interesting books, and like well written, like good to read.
Getting there going.
Oh, there you go. Forming God and Knopfler. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
And so we got these books that are coming out in Old Testament studies, but you're right to say that like in New Testament actually throws this like really interesting kind of curveball to that, right? Which is like that you have Jesus, but then what does that mean about God's embodiment if the emphasis of Jesus is that Jesus is in the flesh? But it seems to me like, that fits along with the line of kind of the embodiment studies that we see in taking the body seriously, but also with Mary, right? And we one of the things that's like strikes people about Marian art and devotion is like the focus on embodiment that for like many contemporary Protestant Christians, like kind of feels sometimes a little bit strange, or like makes people feel a little uncomfortable. Like images of Mary breastfeeding Jesus, which are common throughout the history of Christian art, can sometimes make people kind of cringe. Contemporary Christians cringe, in part because of like our kind of purity, our thoughts about purity in the body and stuff like this. But so in a way, like does some of your work kind of address some of those contemporary issues of kind of shame about body, or or kind of thinking that the body doesn't matter as much as the soul or spirit, or is there a different avenue that it might touch on for today's kind of for our popular imagination?
Yeah, no, I think there's several touch points for our popular imagination today, but I definitely think that is one of them. And that's really one of the reasons why I also got interested in this project, because I think you're exactly right. I mean, at least in my own tradition. So I come out of the United Methodist Church. In my own tradition, there's been, in my own experience at least, there has been this emphasis on sort of head knowledge, right? It's about this kind of mental assent, and that's what constitutes belief, right? And the more I dug into reading the New Testament, I said, actually, these concerns with embodiment run really deep. And the example you just named, for instance, of these many images of Mary breastfeeding Jesus, you would know more about this than I would, but I tend to think that part of what's driving some of those images is this concern that we see quite early on, actually, in Christian tradition, this concern to emphasize that Jesus is a human. Jesus is embodiment as a fleshly human being. And one of the ways you do that is by emphasizing Mary's own humanity. She was a mother breastfeeding her child and so forth. So yes, I really do think it helps to address these sort of tendencies that I've at least experienced in Christianity, of kind of downplaying the importance of the body, or like the shame associated with the body, like you mentioned, and saying actually there is, it hasn't always been that way, right? We need to pay attention to the importance of embodiment.
Yeah. I love it. And I love the connection, Brennan, that you're drawing to Mary, obviously, because that's our study. And even we won't talk much about this today, but some of the work that I was reading in preparing for today was talking about how the mystery of Christ being both human and divine. And, it takes the church hundreds of years to figure that out. And, we could have a whole course on that. But that there is some parallel between, these controversies about the identity of Christ and how the church begins to think of Mary. But fundamentally is, the church wants to be really clear that like Mary wasn't just a vessel for this holy seed, this set apart seed or divine seed, but that actually it is this sort of weaving together of human and divine. And the church really goes out on a limb to do this. And as a result, sort of reflection on Mary is exalted as well. But at the base, it's that, wow, Jesus was human. God became human, actually human, fully human. And if that's the case, that means that the human God was at one point a toddler, and at one point was an infant, and at one point was probably a rambunctious adolescent, if we think that that's part of, human growth, not necessarily sin.
Seems inevitable, yeah.
Although, the Calvinists in the room might want to have a conversation about that. But it's fascinating. And so Mary beyond the New Testament is really our topic for today, really in early Christianity. And for those of you that don't know, Brittany Wilson wrote a really great, a very informative and very accessible article on Mary in the Women's Bible Commentary called Mary and Her Interpreters. And in that article, Brittany, you conclude by saying this. There it is. Yes, she's got all of this show and tell. All I've got is like a pencil and a notepad with one piece of paper on it. But in this article, you conclude by saying this: there is a plethora of portraits in Mary's long and multivalent interpretive history. And so I just want to start by asking you to share some of those portraits that you found in preparing to write that article, or that you find particularly relevant or compelling as we think about Mary.
Yeah, no, thanks, Chris. So I find it very fascinating because early on in Christian tradition, we really only see Mary coming up more in a tangential fashion. Now, there are some exceptions to that rule, but for the most part, as you just intimated a few minutes ago, Mary primarily comes up when early Christians are really wrestling with Jesus's divine and human nature, right? So she comes up in these early kind of Christian sort of heresy debates and Christological debates. She's not really a figure who is discussed on her own terms. But when we get to the Middle Ages, things really start to change. We really start to, at that point in history, to see this explosion of interest in Mary. And she really becomes a kind of figure in her own right, if you will, in terms of Christians' interest in her. And it's during this period of the Middle Ages and beyond that we start to see this plethora of images as you just read. So I named just a few in the article, excuse me. So Queen of Heaven is a really common image that we see of Mary. Some of you probably have seen images of Mary in this fashion if you've been to a museum. It says usually Mary is in heaven. Sometimes she is kind of decked out in garb that we might see the woman who is clothed with the sun, who appears in Revelation 12. Sometimes she'll have a crown of stars, which the woman in Revelation 12 wears. And we see this kind of imagery also later being applied to women who are rulers. So Elizabeth I, for example, really adopted some of this Queen of Heaven imagery and her own sort of image that she put forward to her public. Much later, I saw Eva Peron did something very, very similar, adopting some of this Queen of Heaven imagery. So that was a really popular image of Mary that we start to see coming up in the Middle Ages. Another image that we start to see is the Mater Dolorosa, so the Woman of Sorrows. This image of Mary really draws from Luke 2:35, where the prophet Simeon approaches Mary and Joseph when they're in the temple. And Simeon tells Mary that a sword will pierce her own soul, which some people interpret as perhaps a foretelling of the future anguish that she will feel at her son's death. So this particular image of Mary as the mother of sorrows really draws from that verse, as well as the fact that in John's gospel, we see Mary at the foot of the cross, right? And I've got here, actually, I can do my share screen, if that's okay.
Do
I
it,
have
yeah.
an image of one of the most famous sculptures of this image of Mary. Well, let me get it to presenter view. Okay, well, that's not what I want to do, but hopefully you can at least see this image here. You can see it, okay. You can see this image. This is Michelangelo's Pieta. So if anyone has been to the Vatican, you can see this image, but this is, of course, a famous and haunting image of Mary cradling the broken body of her son.
It's beautiful.
Let's say stop share screen. So those are just two of the images that we start to see coming out during this time period.
Yeah. Brennan, it looked like you were like busy. I saw your eyes. You're clearly pulling up an image that you are eager to share with the rest of us.
Well, I just wanted to pull up a kind of a typical kind of a Mary Queen of Heaven just to show. But here's one from Santa Maria Maggiore, one of the most important churches in Rome. And with some mosaics going back to the 4th century even, but this one's later. But you see Jesus kind of crowning Mary Queen of Heaven, and showing her off. You know, this is displaying her. This one is a Baroque sculpture, like this is from Salamanca. This is one of the craziest Mary, Mary of Sorrows, Queen of Sorrows, the Dolorosa images with, you know, the saying from Luke, you know, the sword will pierce her heart, and this kind of very Baroque demonstration of the sorrow that she feels because of the knowledge of Jesus's impending death. So in any event, but I'll just say, like, you know, there's some amazing images out there. But the Pietà, which, by the way, wasn't that the one that like a axe wielding guy in like the 1990s or something tried to destroy the Pietà, and they actually like hacked off part of it in the Vatican, and they had to repair it. Pretty crazy. Right now it's behind like right now no one's seeing it, but usually, you know, these days it's behind this like really thick glass, I think, to protect it. But
I've seen it. It was not behind glass when I was there, so this must have happened when I was there. That's interesting. Huh?
Well, or maybe it was earlier. You know, maybe they've changed the kind of security arrangement, whatever. But I mean, but just to say, like that sculpture has also like received kind of attack, and I've heard this from some different that Mary can be a figure of both devotion and a figure of male anger as well. But some of the images of Mary, do seem to kind of, I don't know, like there's sometimes it seems to kind of focus on her pain in some ways that may not be psychologically healthy. But thanks for those images and those different kind of like iconographic or those different ways that we tend to see Mary encountered in those images.
Well, and I think you tease this out in your article, Brittany, but one of the things that struck me about these images, both artistic renderings, but also just how, people are talking about Mary in sermons or in, theological treatises, is that it identifies Mary with Jesus in really significant ways, but it also identifies Mary with the rest of humanity. And so in the same way that, later Christian reflection on Jesus is connecting Jesus both with God and with humanity, Mary sort of does that as well. So that the mother, I think I remember reading that like the mother of pain, like that becomes an identifying or a place of, we can find consolation in Mary's suffering as we as humans also suffer, that she was one who suffers and therefore provides some sort of connection with human suffering. And so her suffering over the particularity of her son Jesus is sort of bound up to the brokenness and suffering of the world, which I just think is such a beautiful expansion of this reflection and thinking about Mary.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a question for the two of you. The Old Testament surprisingly figures prominently in early Christian devotion to Mary and early Christian reflection on Mary. And you, Brittany, again in your article, talk about a number of sort of images or female figures from the Old Testament that later interpreters say prefigure Mary. And I would love, just for a little bit for us to hear about that and what early Christian interpreters saw in Mary that made them see the Old Testament differently and what it matters for our understanding of who Mary was.
Yeah, no, thanks, Chris. So of course, I think the go-to text, the go-to kind of Old Testament text that a lot of people think of perhaps is Isaiah 7:14, right? Because Matthew himself explicitly cites that text in his own gospel, at the outset of his gospel, in the birth narrative, where you have this sort of prophecy of Isaiah of this virgin or this young girl who is going to bear a son named Emmanuel, right? And Matthew kind of explains it. Emmanuel meaning God with us, or God is with us, right? So that's the kind of text that Matthew himself incorporates into his gospel. But during the Middle Ages, you start to see a lot of Christian interpreters incorporating what's become known as sort of typological readings. Right. So like you said, this kind of reading certain characters in the Old Testament in ways that we're seen to sort of prefigure characters in the New Testament. So we see this happening with Jesus. So Isaac, for example, is frequently seen as a sort of type, if you will, a sort of prefigurement of Jesus and Jesus's crucifixion. But we also see this happening with Mary. And some of the types, some of the characters in the Old Testament, there are many, but just some of the more popular ones that we see Christian interpreters from the Middle Ages on really kind of highlighting and picking up. Oh, are you there?
Anticipated that this might happen.
Okay, can you hear me now?
So Chris, okay. Great.
Okay. So I don't know how much y'all missed, but I was just saying that some of the most prominent or some of the most popular Old Testament characters that we see Christians during the Middle Ages really picking up in these typological readings are people like Miriam, so Moses' sister from Exodus and Numbers. We see Sophia, or woman wisdom, from Proverbs 8. Those are two of the more popular ones. Oh, the bride from the Song of Songs, right? That's another popular one. Although perhaps the most famous one is more of an anti-type, if you will, and that's of course Eve, right? Mm-hmm. Mary is kind of seen as being the anti-type, or the response, if you will, to Eve from the Old Testament.
In the same way that Jesus would be the counterpoint to Adam, and kind of the second and better version of Adam, that Eve is the second and better. I mean, that Mary is the second and better version of Eve, etc.
Exactly. Yeah. So and Paul talks about this, right? So Jesus being the sort of the second Adam kind of figure, and we see similar moves that people make with respect to Mary and Eve.
Yeah, and we see. So, for example, we see Paul doing this in Romans 5 as a typical text. And
I'll share a screen again. I can pull this up.
Yeah, do that.
All right. Got Romans 5 here.
Yeah.
People don't have their Bibles handy, right? So you can see here in Romans 5, Paul saying, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death came through sin, and so death spread to all because all have sinned. Sin was indeed in the world because the law, but sin is not reckoned when there is no law. Yet death exercised dominion from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sins were not like the transgressions of Adam, who is a type of the one who was to come, right? And this type language that I've sort of tried to highlight here, the Greek word here is tupos. Right? So we have Christ, the one who is to come, so meaning Jesus, right? So we have Jesus as this, or Adam rather, as a type of Jesus, someone who kind of, again, prefigures him, points ahead to Jesus. And this is, of course, where we get our word typological from.
Yeah. And so, the logic that Paul is working with, at least in Romans, is in Romans 5 is Adam introduced transgression and sin, and therefore death to the whole world. And so that's A. B is Christ introduced faithfulness and gave life to the world and forgiveness of sins. And in 1 Corinthians 15, it's similar, but it's that this dust human becomes life, becomes alive, and then Jesus becomes the life-giving spirit at the resurrection. And so there's these contrasts of death and life, of transgression and forgiveness or release. And so then help us understand how then Mary relates to Eve. If that's the sort of the working typology of Adam and Christ, then where do we see these similarities and differences between Eve and Mary?
Yeah, and bear with me, I'll share screen once more here. Okay, so if y'all can see this here, I've tried to kind of put up on the screen where we see this happening. So one of the first people who really popularized this move of not just sort of seeing Adam as a type of Christ, like we see in Paul in Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15, but we see a sort of parallel move being made between Eve and Mary. One of the first people who really popularized that move is Irenaeus, one of our early church fathers writing in the 2nd century, right? And so you can see here on the screen how I've tried to, I've obviously taken out a bunch of his argument here, but you can see, so he's riffing off of what Paul has done. So that kind of begins his conversation. You can see again, so he mentions Adam as Adam became the beginning of those who die. So and Irenaeus is very much talking about salvation history, right? The role of these figures, in this case, Adam and Christ, in salvation history. And then this is where he makes the parallel move, this bit that I've underlined here. So, and thus also it was that the knot of Eve's disobedience was loosed by the obedience of Mary. For what the Virgin Eve had bound fast through unbelief, this did the Virgin Mary set free through faith. So he's seeing Mary and Eve also playing this very important role in salvation history, although of course with Mary, he's focusing more not on her salvific death and so forth, like with Christ, he's focusing more on her belief, on her faith, right?
Which as we talked a little bit last week about is one of those places in the Gospel of Luke that this is a place where we can see a clear connection where it's her faithfulness, her faithful response to the angel's message to her is sort of characteristic of her character, of who she is, and it's a model for later Christians. And so Irenaeus here is capturing that this sort of faithful response and obedience to a crazy claim is what Mary exemplifies. And in so doing, she's undoing this earlier disobedience. It's so, I mean, one of the things that we don't have to spend so much time here, but is that later scholars have suggested is that this then raises the question of Mary's role in the plan of salvation, in redemption and bringing humanity back to God. That if you accept this parallel between Mary and Eve, it gives her a much more significant role of sort of reversing the consequences of original sin, if we want to talk about it that way.
Yeah. No, I agree. Mm-hmm.
Fascinating. Brennan, anything about the Old Testament? I mean, you study it occasionally, I think.
Yeah, I mean, well, and some people would react to this by saying, hey, that this typological stuff is, minimizing the Old Testament, and it's introducing kind of new ways of reading it. Origen is doing something crazy that people haven't done before, and this is, sort of misusing the Old Testament. I mean, as an Old Testament scholar, the Old Testament is full of typology. Like, this happens all the time. So Jeremiah is the new Moses. This is a very, very common move in like ancient writing of all kinds, that you're kind of in the type of someone. And this often happens through kind of writing these stories that develop that use the typological connection as a way of trying to explore theology and explore like the consequences of theology. What are we supposed to do with our lives and how are we supposed to act? So the writing of the book of Jeremiah as basically like a drama in some way, involving somebody trying to kind of be Moses in a different context, in a different time and different place than Moses was. What happens then, so it is kind of a way of thinking through, God and humanity and our ethical obligations to one another. So all to say, like, I mean, I look at this as an extension of, earlier Jewish ways of reading texts, with some, Greco-Roman ways of thinking. But by the time of Jesus, there's no separation really between like kind of Greek ways of thinking and Jewish ways. It's all mixing together at that point within Judaism. But it does raise some really interesting theological questions. And I personally really like Irenaeus's kind of theology of what he's got a term for it, right? Like kind of seconding, like that Jesus is in some way kind of living through the Adam experience again and doing it better this time, and opening up a way for us to be better too. There is something about that is like quite just interesting to me. But it is interesting too about the role that it gives to Mary and how much agency it gives her, and how much weighs on her. That this kind of gives more gravity to that, but also, this is the role of a human in the story, like the pure human, in the story of salvation. But it does lead to some of the things that we see in other early Christian writings, right? Like, these stories that try to think about Mary's birth then, because if Mary is playing this extra special role in creation, how is she special? Because the Gospels don't really say much about how she is special, other than she is favored among women, and she seems like a person who's receptive to the angel's question. She's willing to bear the suffering that is to come in the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. She is faithful at the cross at the end. But the Gospels themselves don't spend a lot of time exploring who she is and what brought her to this point, what made her. So it seems like much of what Jews around the time of Jesus were doing, the evidence we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls, was that they were using literature, like making narratives, as a way of exploring these theological questions that the Bible, like earlier scripture, had left unexplored, like the stories of Enoch or something, right, which have to do with life and death and heaven and earth and the relationship between them and stuff. And so, but so how were early Christians using these stories, like, thinking about narrative as a way of exploring these dimensions of Mary that the Gospels themselves don't really delve into in enough detail, at least to satisfy theologians?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting question. And just to pick up on an earlier point that you made, I think it's a really important point to emphasize that while, yes, we see this explosion of sort of typological readings of Mary in the Middle Ages, I think it's really important to emphasize that this is a way of reading that extends well before that. Like, right, again, we see it, Paul is doing this. I loved your explanation of what we see kind of Old Testament writers do. I'm thinking of someone like Philo, right? Writing around the time of Jesus, a Jewish philosopher really influenced by sort of Middle Platonism. And we see him making these typological moves, which of course Origen, who you also mentioned, picks up on in his own writings in the 2nd century. So I appreciate you highlighting how this kind of way of reading, while it may feel foreign to us today, it actually has a really long and rich tradition. And the latter point that you just raised, I think, is a really interesting question, because for me, when I read some of these later texts in Mary's own interpretive history, I feel like a lot of times people are kind of maybe trying to fill in the gaps, right? Because we don't hear, the references to Mary are so few in the New Testament. Okay, maybe Paul refers to her in Galatians 4:4 when he says Christ was born of a woman. That might just also be a standard way of referring to a human being, right? Humans are born from a mother, a woman.
How else?
Maybe in Revelation 12, on one level, the woman clothed with the sun could be Mary. That certainly became popular in later Christian tradition. But it's really only in the Gospels that we see Mary, and only then, not very much, right? She's certainly relegated to being more of a want to say a minor character. She plays a really prominent role at the outset of Luke's gospel, right? But we don't have a whole lot of information about Mary. And so I see in later Christian tradition, I wonder if later Christians kind of felt unsatisfied, if you will, by some of this lack of detail, and they wanted to know more. They wanted to fill in the gaps, and they start their touch points are very frequently these references we do have in Scripture, like the Queen of Heaven imagery, for example, drawing from Revelation 12, right? Or the Mother of Sorrows, drawing from Luke 2 and the end of John's Gospel. But I see it as sort of perhaps Christians having this kind of expansion of imagination, if you will, or trying to fill in the gaps and think more fully about Mary and her role in salvation history.
Yeah. And one of the sort of go-to texts that I'm eager to jump into with you, Brittany, is known as the Pro Evangelium of James, or the like pre-gospel of James. And it's, as far as we know,
PJ, that's how I refer to it. When I
PJ is fine. Not the things that many of us are still wearing, but an abbreviation for this. It's a 2nd century text, middle of the 2nd century, probably. Super fascinating. It is clearly derivative of our New Testament Gospels. There's clear echoes of both Luke and Matthew throughout it. But it finds this gap of we don't know anything about Mary's childhood. Well, let's figure that out. And it does. It's a tremendous example of narrative theology, because by telling this story about Mary's upbringing and her own miraculous birth, the author communicates really important things about Jesus and about Mary and about what Christianity probably was like in the 2nd century, and trying to figure this out. So what would you want to say, sort of by way of introductory, if people have never experienced PJ in the morning, what are they looking forward to in this fascinating text from the 2nd century?
Well, for anyone who hasn't read it, I do recommend reading it. It's a fascinating text. If you want, there are several different, pardon me as I reach here and get some more books. I'm surrounded by books.
I love it. I love the visual cues here. Yeah. This is giving me some inspiration.
There went one. So the translation I usually use, these are on 2 early Christian infancy narrative gospels. So PJ and the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which is also a very fun, can be very shocking read for people who haven't read it before.
Is this the one with the clay pigeons? He makes the clay birds?
Yeah. Where Jesus is, speaking of petulant children, it's Jesus as a very petulant child, right? So this is PJ, the text we're referring to now is in this text. It's also at the very end. There's a translation as well as a discussion in Beverly Gaventa's book on Mary.
Yeah.
She focuses on Mary's presentation in the 4 Gospels, but at the end she has a discussion of PJ. So if people are interested, those are some good places to go. But like Chris was saying, so PJ, it's a mid to late 2nd century text. A lot of people think it's a bios, or a life of Mary. So bios, kind of where we get our later word biography, right? And they think it's possibly a life of Mary because this text, interestingly, is focused primarily on Mary. She is the main protagonist, if you will. And that's also what makes this text so unusual during this time period. Because like I mentioned earlier, most of the interest in Mary from the 2nd century, 2nd and 3rd century, was her role in these larger kind of Christological controversies, right? Again, the main sort of focus was Jesus and his humanity and divinity, and Mary kind of played a supporting role. But with this text, with this 2nd century text, we see Mary, interestingly, again, as the main character. She plays the central role in this text. And some scholars even think they sort of, in terms of genre, define it more narrowly as an encomium, or a sort of praise of Mary. Because Mary comes off looking really good in this text. It's all about sort of lifting up her as a person, and sort of highlighting her own sort of sacred purity, as Gaventa likes to call it. So if you sit down and read this text, it's going to begin with sort of before Mary is even born. Again, this text is kind of filling in the gaps, if you will, right? We want to know more about Mary. Where did she come from? I think of this text as kind of a prequel. Right?
Yeah.
I personally, as someone who loves prequels, like like Wolverine prequel, for the X-Men variety, the new Harry Potter movies. I mean, I think as a society, we kind of like prequels. Someone is important. You want to know how they got to be who they are. Batman Begins, right? Classic prequel,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay. So this text is kind of functioning as a prequel in many ways. And so it takes it back all the way to before she was born. It starts with her parents, right? So if you've ever heard of Anna, right? Anna as Mary's mother, right? That's coming from PJ, right? So we learn about Anna. We learn about Mary's parents and how Mary herself was miraculously conceived. So it pushes back. So it wasn't just Jesus who was miraculously conceived, but it pushes it back to Mary's own conception in this particular text. And then the text goes on and discusses Mary's childhood. We learn that when she's raised in the temple, right? When she's age 12, right? At that point, we learn that Joseph, so now Joseph comes into the picture, and Joseph doesn't marry Mary, but he becomes this kind of guardian figure.
Right.
He's in charge of kind of taking care of her, right? And then we learn that Mary becomes pregnant. A main emphasis on the text is how Joseph is not the father, right? This is, again, a miraculous pregnancy. And that really is the focus of the rest of the text.
Yeah. No need to go on the Maury Povich show. We know who the father is.
Yeah.
Sorry, anybody that gets that reference, you're like, get a golden star from me for this morning. And if my wife was watching this, she would be doing a major eye roll. But yeah, so this text is so fascinating because we can see some of the gaps that are filling could be things that are perhaps problematic about the New Testament Gospels narration about Mary. There are things like we talked about last week, like, oh, she comes from Nazareth. She's sort of like from a, maybe a backwater Galilee, backwater town. Well, Mary's, background in PJ is that she's actually like born to a pretty prominent family, a priestly family. And so we fill in that gap. Or there's, the questions that
and she lived in the temple for a long time and was, yeah. And as I remember, is this a part of PJ or is this kind of like a later addition to PJ, like a medieval part that she was given to the temple with some like miraculous cloth and that she turned that into the veil that hung in the temple that she actually wove.
Yeah.
Little Mary in the temple, her job was to weave the veil of the temple that later was rent at Jesus's death. So like there's all this kind of foreshadowing stuff that's in there. It's a kind of a beautiful and theologically significant, I think, way of thinking about Mary. Yeah.
Yeah. And we understand now how Jesus can have brothers, right? Because Joseph is a widower, and these are his older brother or his older children from from his previous, from his previous marriage. Mm-hmm. And so now we're moving our way into a later concept of Mary as a perpetual virgin. That and this is bound up with 3rd and 4th century reflections on original sin, and that original sin is passed on through sexual intercourse, and so Mary couldn't have engaged in sexual intercourse, and because of her high status, and so
her own conception then, right? So like this is where we get the stuff that later turns into the theology of the Immaculate Conception, which doesn't mean Jesus, right? Immaculate Conception means Mary's Immaculate Conception. Yeah, right. Because she had to be sinless if she was to give birth to the sinless one.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. That's right. And because the later sort of Augustinian, I'm sure it's earlier than Augustine, but like that's where we really get the idea that original sin is in our DNA because of sexual intercourse. And so Mary would have been guilty of that, genetic trait unless she had a miraculous birth herself. And that's exactly right, Brennan.
She's kind of the short circuit that like allows for the opportunity for Jesus to emerge as someone who has the potential to save humanity from sin. If that, just to say, we got a couple of comments on Facebook. One is Fred saying that Joseph is the beard. like Joseph is the one who's kind of covering for Mary, in the relationship, if that makes sense, which is, I think, is a good insight. But one question from Linda Morningstar. She asks.
I'm glad I saw that one too, Brennan. I was going to bring it in. I'm so glad.
Yeah. She says one of her relatives taught her children that the Catholic Church is the place where they pray to Mary. That was a way that some Protestants will talk about the Catholic. They pray to Mary there, right? She says, can you say anything about Mary as the one who hears and responds to prayer? And is that something that we see anything about in the Bible itself, or is this something that emerges in later tradition? And if so, do we know kind of where this idea emerges of Mary as one who hears and perhaps responds to prayer?
Yeah, so in my understanding, this sort of understanding of Mary really develops out of another medieval portrait of Mary that we see, and that is her status as mediatrix, this kind of mediator kind of figure. And what I think is really important, though, to remember when we're talking about Mary's role as this kind of mediator figure, there's sort of two kind of components to it. The first one is one that later Protestants wouldn't really take much issue with, right? So I'm thinking, the Reformation, and Mary often bore the brunt of sort of Protestant iconoclastic zeal and so forth. But the first part of her role as this mediator kind of figure was her role in the larger salvation plan of history, right? So she's this kind of mediator figure, and that she is a human who is bearing the Son of God, right? So that Protestants tend to take issue with, but it's the other sort of component of her roles as mediatrix, and that is the intercessory part. So because she plays this kind of intermediary role in salvation history, a lot of Christians also thought she could play this sort of intercessory role with respect to humans communing with God. So since Mary was a human who bore God, right? God and thus Jesus are seen as being kind of this more judge kind of figure, and Mary, I don't want to say, Mary was kind of more approachable, if you will, in some ways. Right. So that's where a lot of that kind of tradition, again, in my understanding, stems from. And it's that component of Mary as mediatrix that later Protestants really took issue with.
Yeah, and I think you can see this too. And I'm going to share screen for just a moment. You can see this in some of the earliest images we have of Mary. So this is an image from the Catacomb of Priscilla, a wealthy Roman woman who was a Christian who donated some of her land to become catacombs. And catacombs, of course, were not places that Christians fled from persecution necessarily. They were places where they buried people. That you weren't allowed to bury inside the walls of Rome. So people buried their body. People took care of their friends and relatives' bodies in spaces that were dug into the soft lava rock around Rome. But so this is one of those places that was decorated, and we see here this is from probably the 3rd century, so sometime well before the time of Constantine. This might be the earliest image of Mary we have, according to some art historians. But we see Mary with the child here, and that Jesus is kind of looking at us, the viewer, right? But he's might be being breastfed, or is being cared for, at least, kind of held by Mary, who is looking at the child. And then you have the star above, and then someone coming to Mary, maybe one of the 3 wise men. We also have this very early depiction that was part of a funeral image, and this was for Severa, this person who had died, and this was marking their place of death. So in Deo vivas, living in God. And then you see the 3 wise men coming with the star and Mary. So this kind of depiction we can see drawing on the Gospels, but also the idea of Mary being like a mediator, right? That she is the one through whom these people encounter Jesus seems to be one of the earliest kind of images of Mary. Now, that doesn't seem to be terribly well developed in terms of the theology, but that's probably, I don't know, the way I look at it, that might be some of the kind of when we look at art, a lot of times what we're seeing is kind of folk theology, or what people actually think about the Bible. But so that Mary, real people, someone died and they said, hey, I want this image of, like, someone chose this, right? This woman chose an image of Mary holding the Christ child, and people approaching the Christ child with gifts, right? Like this was the symbol of her life and her death, and just taking that seriously as this that Mary played this central role in presenting Jesus to the world. in one of the earliest pictures we have of Mary. I just kind of find that moving, but also maybe the seeds of kind of these later. I mean, a lot of Protestant Christians would say, well, that stuff's really late. That stuff about Mary being Queen of Heaven and the mediator of heaven. I mean, all that's just medieval hocus pocus, right? That Luther got rid of, right? I mean, that is what a lot of Protestants would say. Yeah. But to say that, like, there were Christians before the time of Constantine, there's still not like a fully formed kind of Bible yet, and people are still developing. People are already developing these. We have to kind of read around the lines a bit, but they're developing a nascent theology of Mary as being one who mediates Christ to the world.
Yeah, well, and I also think, again, like I am Protestant and, happy to be Protestant and all that, but this is also a place where you can actually trace it back to the New Testament. And again, the wedding at Cana that we talked about last week with Dr. Susan Hyland is an example of Jesus in his full divinity is commanded to do something by his human mother. And so it's not far to take that from, this very, memorable image that Mary as his mother has a particular access point to Jesus and is able to.
Chris, I'm losing you a bit.
Oh, yeah, he froze for me too.
Right there next to Jesus. Would you? Oh, sorry. It's because my kids are playing Xbox. I'm absolutely sure. But I was just saying that, it's the proximity of Mary that the Catholics are saying, hey, will you just give Jesus a nudge in our direction? And again, it's not to say that Christians can't pray directly to Jesus or can't pray directly to God, but why not have a few extra people joining you in that petition? And again, this is where I find a lot of connection, interdenominational connection, where why do we do prayer requests as a community of faith if we don't think that like having other people pray for us is beneficial? Otherwise, like, I just got this. I'll just pray to God and hope that he holds me. But this community element, and then it just sort of builds and builds to saying, oh, wow, this is the mother of Jesus who was able to get him to do that silly miracle at Canaan. And surely she can convince Jesus to be merciful in this moment or to respond favorably in this moment. And so, again, it's just all of this, there are seeds of all of this in the New Testament. And of course it gets extrapolates and builds, but we can find some of the seeds in the New Testament itself.
No, I think this is a really important point because, and again, I'm speaking as a Protestant, but I feel like for so many Protestants, Mary is never discussed. And I think it's a real problem. I think it's partly in reaction. We've inherited the Reformation's own sort of, again, targeting of Mary. And again, she was the object of this iconoclastic zeal, right? But I think there is a real, so speaking as a Protestant, I think there's a real problem with that. First, in sort of dismissing all of this Catholic medieval stuff about Mary. No, these have very deep roots. Right, as you just pointed out, Chris. And a lot of these sort of touch points go back to the Bible itself. And, oh, right, if we're Protestants, right, the sort of mantra of the Reformation was sola scriptura, right? If we don't talk about Mary, well, that can be a real problem because she is in the Bible.
Right.
Right? I mean, again, she's not as prominent as, let's say, Jesus, but she is, she's in 4 of our Gospels, perhaps mentioned by Paul, perhaps in Revelation 12, right? And so I find this silence about Mary, or if we only discuss Mary when Christmas comes around, right? I find that actually deeply problematic. And I try to encourage my students, at least, who are, again, for the most part, Protestant, to really try to reclaim Mary and her importance in the Bible and in Christian tradition.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that from one of the things I try to talk about in the Old Testament about depictions of God is that the Hebrew Bible is a bit unusual. The Old Testament is unusual in its cultural context because it doesn't clearly gender God in one specific way. That is, Yahweh, the God of Israel, is described with and is male, masculine pronouns are used to refer to this God in the Bible. masculine verbs are used to describe this God's actions. But at the same time, there are many feminine images of God and female, incarnate female images of God. That is, God in Isaiah, God breastfeeds the people of Israel and nourishes them and nurtures them like a mother. Or in the book of Job, in chapter 38, God is pictured as a woman who gives birth to the cosmos and gives birth even to the kind of chaotic waters of creation, and then takes care of them, swaddles them in a cloth, and so on. So all to say that these feminine images of God are really important, in part because they are somewhat different from the very highly gendered masculine and feminine roles that ancient Near Eastern gods and goddesses played. So in the New Testament, though, we also get this kind of gendered image of God in gendered languages about God, typically in a masculine form, God the Father, and so on. And Jesus is gendered as a male, in the New Testament. Although, as many early Christian scholars have pointed out, that Jesus's masculinity is not typical kind of, there are some issues. Jesus is not married. He's a grown man who's not married, who doesn't seem very interested in marriage, but is not an ascetic. That is to say that he's like out there talking to people and hangs out with women, but it's like, so Jesus's gender seems a bit complicated, more complicated than we might imagine. He's definitely not the macho Jesus guy that we see, plastered all over images today. But so Mary does play this really important and I think interesting role in kind of offering a feminine image that can be associated with God in the New Testament. I mean, as an Old Testament scholar, I don't know much about how this works or these arguments or these, but what do you all think about that Mary kind of offers a way for us to think at least about God's mother, right? And to think about, expanding, instead of Jesus just representing all of humanity in his masculinity, instead having this kind of feminine image that we can associate with God. What do you all think about that?
Yeah, I think that's also something that Protestants perhaps lose when we sort of sideline Mary or don't talk about her. And I would also say, and Chris, you may have something you want to say more on this point, but on the question of Jesus's masculinity, which I have a lot of opinions about.
If you do, you might have written about that in your class.
Yeah.
But I also love this image that we get in both Luke and Matthew of Jesus himself kind of taking on this role as mother, if you will, when he identifies himself as a mother hen.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about sort of wanting to gather Jerusalem, kind of gather his chicks, if you will, his babies under his wings, which I think is lovely imagery. It's picking up on imagery that's used of God in the Old Testament, of God having sort of protecting wings and offering kind of nurture and protection under those wings, but also explicitly identifying as a mother hen, a female bird, if you will. And so, and again, the connection, the mothering connection there, right? Yeah. So I love that from narrative detail we learn about Jesus also in the Gospels. But Chris, were you going to say something?
Yeah, no, I don't have a lot to add. I mean, thank you for the reference to the mother hen. It's such a powerful image. I think, Brennan, to your question, where I sit today, I would say I think attending to the significance of Mary in early Christian literature would at least be a lens that refracts what is perhaps overlooked or underestimated in the Old Testament. And so even if we don't want to venerate Mary to the point of being, the female equivalent of the so-called male God of the Old Testament, I think that would be problematic on so many levels.
Right.
What Mary's role in the life of Jesus and later in the life of the church would suggest is, this is also characteristic of the divine. This is also characteristic of divine love. And we would then be much more open to calling attention to those places in the Old Testament and elsewhere in Scripture where motherly love comes out. And I say all of this completely aware of the dangers of gender essentialism and all of that. But again, just to see in Mary a refraction of an image of God that we perhaps are not so familiar with or not so comfortable talking about in a modern context that tends to use male language for God almost exclusively in a lot of contexts. So I think that that's a great question and a really insightful one. So, okay, Brennan, I think we're at time. It's 10:30. We've covered so much ground. I'm tempted to share for laughs the meme that I was able to find of Maury Povich reading, in the case of baby Jesus, Joseph, you are not the father. But, you can imagine it. I'll send it later. But thank you, Brittany, for this super, super helpful and informative conversation. Thank you all on Facebook Live and on Zoom for joining us. Please come back next week. We are going to be joined by my friend who was a Louisville doctoral fellow with me, or a postdoctoral fellow with me, Dr. Zainab Zailagan, who is a Muslim scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. And we are going to talk about Mary in the Quran and in Islam. And so you don't want to miss it. We've talked a good bit about Roman Catholicism today, and next week will be a fascinating study of Mary in the Quran. So please join us again next week at 9:30.
Yeah, Brittany, I'm sorry that this was not as fun as eating asparagus together in an old, destroyed fortress in Germany, which we have done before. This is a pale comparison to that pale asparagus that we ate together. But in any event, thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to do this. This is hugely, it was fascinating, so helpful for me. I mean, I've never really spent much time working with the Pro Evangelium of James, but this was so just thought-provoking, and I really appreciate all the time and effort and your visual cues as well. Thank you for actually bringing the books to show, which we should probably do every week.
That's right.
Thank you so much to you both, and thank you for having me. It's been a joy.
Great. All right, y'all. We'll see you next time.
Peace.